Majoring in philosophy, is it a death sentence for your career? Let's ask some of my former students. I'm Christopher Annadale, and this is Life After Philosophy. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Rebecca Schisler-Adams. Rebecca is a 2017 graduate of Mount St. Mary's with a major in philosophy and sociology. She is a 2020 graduate of Catholic University of America Law School. After completing a judicial clerkship in the Circuit Court for Anne Arundel County, she has been practicing civil litigation. She is currently an associate attorney at Council Baradel, located in Annapolis, Maryland, where she practices real estate litigation. She's also married and has a 9-month-old daughter. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm glad that you agreed to come on, because you've followed one of those paths that is maybe somewhat typical for people imagining what they'll do with a philosophy degree besides teach. You went into law. You went directly to law school.
I did.
Finishing your bachelor's degree. Would you tell us about what that was like and how you saw some of your philosophy education being useful in that?
Yeah, totally. And it's funny, it all goes back to my sophomore year at the Mount, where I had to take a class on modern philosophy that was taught by Dr. Mike Miller. Still to this day, one of my favorite classes I've ever taken. But I'll never forget the day that we had class, and he started the class with kind of a pitch for why you should major or minor in philosophy. And one of the slides on his PowerPoint presentation was the rate of LSAT scores, which is the law school admissions test, and how philosophy majors statistically had higher LSAT scores than other majors. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted to go to law school, but I hadn't quite narrowed down what I wanted to study in college yet, because they tell you if you know you're going to go to law school, your major in college doesn't really matter because the JD is what is going to matter in the long run. And so I remember listening to that presentation and how creative and well done it was. And I told him after class that I was sold, and I went and declared my major in philosophy that day.
That's awesome. Wow.
And I found it to be true, because going through my 4 years at the Mount, I had to take several classes that not only prepared me exactly for the law school admissions test, but for the way that law school is designed. So, for example, logic is a class that you take as a philosophy major, and the logic games and the way that you think about these, necessary and sufficient conditions and all of these different ways to orient your brain to think about logical reasoning is exactly how you study for the LSAT. So I already had that knowledge going into preparation for the test that made studying for it less stressful, I think. And then moving into law school, similarly, when you file a complaint, when you're engaged in litigation, it's very much those same, are you satisfying these elements that you learn about in your logic class in order to prove your case in front of a judge? So we're trying to satisfy certain elements to make sure that we actually have a case for our client. So it's very similar. So that's one way. Similarly, many other classes that I took embraced the Socratic method, which is entirely what law school is all about. Every class you take in law school is very much of an open forum. The professor is shooting questions at us, and we are frequently cold called and expected to be able to answer the question on our feet, having read the material the night before. And so our philosophy classes at the Mount certainly prepared me for that kind of open discussion mentality that I think a lot of my classmates who had studied business or political science may not have been as familiar with that stylistic way of learning.
Well, that's great. That's great. Let me jump in with a question, if I might.
Yeah.
You talk about, you can think about, okay, here's some things that help in philosophy. It increases your clarity of thought. It maybe gives you a sharper, more attuned BS detector. It makes you accustomed to answering questions that are sort of jumping at you. You have to think on your feet. These are all kind of skills, and we might say kind of formal properties of the study of philosophy. Is there anything in the content of what you studied in philosophy that you think became relevant to your life, either in law school or as a lawyer? and any specific
Absolutely.
sort of type of knowledge that you acquired?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it ranges anywhere from the classics and the ancient philosophers all the way up to modern day. I had the privilege at the Mount of taking classical philosophy, ancient philosophy. I took political philosophy and philosophy of law. And all of those schools of thought are very much prevalent in our for our legislators and for our judges today. How are we going to write laws, draft laws, follow laws in a way that makes sense for the common good, right? Because when you think about what legislators are doing at work every day, they're trying to find one law that makes sense for the vast majority of people. In a sense, it's very utilitarian. But as we know, utilitarianism isn't exactly the philosophy that all of us want to follow. So there's always this, pull and tug of what is the best thing for the best number of people as far as writing laws goes. But then when you're in the litigation stage, and also for all types of attorneys, there's always that question of how do I best represent my client, even if sometimes my client's interests aren't great. Or the classic question that people are always asked is in the criminal context, if you've got a public defender. And so for those of you who don't know, our Constitution is written in such a way that if you are accused of a crime and you can't afford an attorney, you are appointed one by the state. And that is a fully barred attorney, public defender that works in the public defender's office full time, whose sole job is to respond to your Miranda rights and represent you in court if you can't afford it. And people frequently ask public defenders, how can you spend your day representing murderers, the worst of the worst people that have committed really terrible crimes? And that is very much a philosophical question. But frequently the answer is, well, every person has a dignity that needs to be upheld. Every person is ideally better than the worst mistake they've ever made in their lives. Every person still has value that deserves to be upheld. And I think also on a more meta level, as philosophers and those of us that have studied philosophy of law and political philosophy, we also know that the government can be dangerous. And we don't want the government to have too much power. Socrates taught us that. And so in that regard, the role of a public defender becomes making sure that the trial is fair, making sure that the person's interests are best protected, even if we know at the outcome they're going to have a guilty verdict. So all of these things are moving at all times in the minds of attorneys.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
I wonder if you mentioned the common good and the dignity of persons, and this is great. I've had another guest on the podcast, Tom Venzer, who is also an attorney, though I don't think he doesn't practice law at the present time. But I'm wondering about the way in which we think both about legislation, about litigation, about criminal defense. Someone might come at us with a kind of postmodern attitude and say, what's really happening here is the negotiation of conflicting interests in a certain kind of power game. And the attorney, whether as a litigator or legislator, takes a role in that and presents a kind of story or a sort of rhetoric or, a case, a justification that might be used in this or that way. But the way you're speaking seems to appeal to something that's a little bit more grounded in a kind of realism about human people. Has that been the case in your own work and your studies? And do you find that to be shared widely among a group of attorneys or in the law profession generally?
That's a good question. And I do think it's a little bit of both, especially in the context of civil litigation. And I say civil litigation because there's no one's life on the line. Obviously, we're not sending people to jail. No one has died. Well, right. I guess unless you're dealing with a wrongful death or that kind of situation. But in my world, it's a lot of money and a lot of people that are very angry and a lot of people that have had really horrible things happen to them in a financial context or in a life context. And so recognizing their problems as being important to them and them being deserving of the very best representation is important. At the same time, the vast majority of litigation ends up settling. It is a very, very small percentage of complaints that are filed that actually make it to that jury trial at the end of a 2 to 3 year window. And so while my first priority as a litigator is to represent my client's interests to the best of my ability, sometimes representing their interests to the best of my ability actually means knowing where to stop and knowing when I've gotten the best offer I'm going to get from the other side, and when I'm able to present the best offer that I can for my client before getting to trial. And so at that point, it very much is a compromise between both sides that recognizes we both have clients that very much care and their dignity matters and their situation matters, but sometimes the money talks, and sometimes the anxiety and everything that's required in going to a jury trial is going to be outweighed by finding a resolution that both sides can be satisfied with at the end of the day. And so, it's on a case by case basis and a client by client basis, but you certainly have to take into consideration the external factors at play that affect whether or not we're actually going to get this case to trial at the end of that window.
Wow. I appreciate hearing about that, because I know nothing about law, never going to law school myself. One gets a distorted picture from pop culture, especially from TV shows about criminal litigation, criminal law. I wonder, just a sort of a follow-up question or a tangent. Do you think that attorneys do or should give a kind of explicit attention to the common good when they're thinking about what they're doing when representing their clients? Or do you think that sort of the sort of common good is served by attorneys being ethical advocates for their clients in whatever context the client needs them, and sort of doing for the client what the client doesn't have the skills and vocabulary to do for herself?
Certainly. I do think that attorneys, for the most part, have a understanding of the real world impact that our work is going to make. And I'll tell you, actually, a difficult thing for me, the transition from undergrad to law school, was grappling with the text and what I was reading. Because coming from philosophy and sociology as my background, a lot of what I was reading in class was philosophical, metaphorical things, what if, lots of situations that hadn't in fact happened yet. In law school, every case that you read happened and is law currently. So these are people's situations that went all the way up to the Supreme Court that was drastic enough to warrant it to now be the law of the land that everyone in the country follows. That transition was difficult for me to reorient my brain from living in kind of a cloud world to law school, where no, these cases that I'm reading actually happened. Joe Smo, who, trespassed on somebody's yard back in 1970, never thought that his case would end up in the Supreme Court to come down with the law of the land for what is the difference between being a trespasser and being invited. And so I think as attorneys, keeping in mind that every case we file has the potential to be appealed, to make it to the next level, to make it to the circuit, to make it to the Supreme Court, knowing that no case is too small to come up with a niche issue of law that's going to end up affecting everyone is very important. And that's why, as attorneys, we also have ethical obligations to check our sources, to cite things factually, to make sure that the other cases and the precedent that we're presenting to the court is actually what the law is, so that we don't mislead the court to think that he should find in favor of my client when it really should go the other way. I mean, obviously, we're always trying to be persuasive, but we have an ethical obligation to be persuasive in a way that is actually the law. So I certainly think that that's a part of it. And I like to think that most attorneys do know that everything that we do is going to have an impact based on the opinions that are written and the law that comes forward with what we're doing and what we're arguing.
Thanks, Rebecca. Another question. I know you say you do real estate litigation, and you've mentioned the sort of high emotions that are there. You've mentioned the fact that these are real cases, in some cases very ordinary Joe Schmo cases, but then which have this kind of relevance to everybody because of the actual case law that they've generated. But some people thinking about not just about philosophy but about law school might suppose that real estate litigation sounds, quite boring. It doesn't sound boring when you describe it. What's been your experience there? Is it intellectually rewarding?
It's so funny because had I known in law school that this is where I was going to end up, I would never have believed you. In fact, I hated my property classes in law school. At no fault to my professors. My professors were great, but conceptually, I just thought mortgages were boring. And property is very much a class of definitions and vocabulary, learning about what deeds are and deeds of trust. I wanted nothing to do with it. Here I am now, and it is my full practice. And the fun part is the litigation, right? So the underlying issues can be anything, but getting in a courtroom and writing all of the motions, that's what I really enjoy. But to speak specifically about real estate, it can happen to anybody. And I think that that's the interesting thing about this line of work. A sale of a home can go south just like that. Everyone's all happy when you are going to the settlement table, and then 3 days later, when a pipe bursts and it wasn't disclosed, all of a sudden you've already spent a lot of money on buying this house, and now you've got to put up a lot of money on a house that you thought was ready to move into. That's one example of the kinds of things that we deal with. We also deal with title litigation. So you buy a house and you've been in there for 20 years, and all of a sudden you realize that somebody who died 50 years ago left their interest of the property to somebody else that is now making a claim saying that they're a partial owner. And that matters because you've been in this house for 20 years. You really care about whether or not you are the actual owner of this property. And so, it's not the kind of high stakes that you might see in medical malpractice or things like that. But certainly people care a lot about their homes. People care a lot about their rights and what they can do with their homes. And so somebody's got to do it and be the person that represents the interest there. But I do have to say I've enjoyed it a lot more than I ever thought I would, as far as the way that the litigation all pans out.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear you laugh and see the kind of joy you take in the work, just because maybe like philosophy, it's one of those things that from the outside looks like it would be deadly dull. People can't imagine what that
Totally.
life is like.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the classes that you take in law school on particular subjects like property and contracts and I'm trying to think of, intellectual property, whatever it might be, those are classes about what the laws are and what laws we need to follow as people. But when you get into practicing law, it's all style. We can argue about what those laws are all day, but litigation is a lot like theater. There's a big joke in the legal world that there's a theater kid to trial attorney pipeline. We love to be in the courtroom. We love to argue in front of juries. We love the drama that comes with telling a judge about this awesome case that we found and why it's a monologue, why they need to argue in our favor, or why they need to find in our favor. So in that regard, you could take any class in law school, but if you've got a litigator that likes what they do and is good at it, you can, that's all style. That's all just fun stuff.
That's great. That's fun to hear. I sometimes will say to my classes that teaching, college teaching, at least as I've experienced it, is close to 70% acting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of performance that goes on, as well as all the intellectual and pedagogical decision making behind it. The other big thing in your life the past year, as I understand, is the birth of your daughter. You've got a little girl at home, and I think you mentioned in your email reply to me previously that there's some philosophy and some critical thinking and whatnot that go into being a first-time parent. Would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Suffice it to say that I didn't really imagine being in this phase of life as quickly as it ended up happening for me. So having to tell a job 3 months into working there that I was pregnant was not something that I had necessarily been prepared for. And so ever since that very first decision that I had to make, when do I tell my employer that I'm pregnant, all the way up to I actually ended up quitting that job shortly after I returned from maternity leave and am now in a new job. Every decision I've had to kind of grapple with, what is the best thing for my family, what is the best thing for my daughter, and what is it going to take to be a working mom,
It's a
which
whole new
is
dimension in your life,
it's
I'm
a
sure.
whole new dimension, and priorities change and things that we do on weekends change. And so that was one thing that I wanted to take very seriously, knowing from my sociology background, the impact that it could have on her if I'm not present, finding a job that allows me flexibility in hours and, the atmosphere of a law firm that has lots of people with kids, where we're all understanding if somebody can't make it because your kid's got a soccer game or whatnot. All of that's very important. So certainly my education in general has informed different decisions that I've made so far. But she's only 9 months. I haven't gotten to the crazy teenage years of having to grapple with.
Just wait. I have 3 teenagers at home, so I can warn you, but I can't prepare you.
I can understand that.
One of the things we sometimes talk about, at least in our philosophy curriculum, is forming the whole person, is giving you the kind of Socratic self-knowledge, the ability to reflect upon and sort of bring into a kind of integration to your whole person. And it sounds like that you're talking about some of the fruits of that is rethinking or thinking about how you're going to have this what might be called a work-life balance. But part of it is also just, being Rebecca, the mom and the attorney, and being true to all the different elements of what you want to do. Is that something you think philosophy formation, if not explicitly knowledge and skills, helped you with?
Definitely. And that's actually something that, within the context of whatever you call them, bloggers or influencers or other moms that frequently stay at home or that take time off from work, that's a conversation that a lot of modern moms are having about how your identity really becomes consumed by being a mom when you have kids. And it's a topic that is really come up in today's world in the context of mental health and postpartum depression, and how we're going to care for moms that, their whole lives revolve around their babies. And I think I'm really lucky because I have a really great support system. I have awesome friends that, I haven't not been invited to things simply because I have a baby, and my family is very, very helpful and is here whenever they're needed. And that is so important. And I'm very blessed that I have a support system like that, but not everybody does. And so figuring out how to navigate, taking time within your marriage when you have a baby as well is really
Right.
important. It was hard for the first couple of months of her life when, we're barely sleeping and she's napping around the clock, and we put her to bed and we're so tired we'd go to bed at like 8 o'clock at night because we knew we were going to be up 3 hours from then and
Well, I
whatnot.
remember.
Yeah, in recent months it's been better. She goes to bed at 7, and then my husband and I have time to reconnect and pour a glass of wine, pour a glass of bourbon and sit in the basement and just hang out for a bit. But it's funny, we collect bourbon actually, and I was thinking about that in the context of doing this podcast because I read a book while I was in college called I Drink Therefore I Am by Sir Roger Scruton.
Oh, wow.
And it's kind of a play on Descartes, but it's all about the philosophy of wine, and it's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, you really should.
I'll have to check it out. Thanks.
But thinking about, even things as simple as having a glass of wine with your friends is such a big social thing that's really important to prompt discussion and, become yourself again. And so I've just tried to really keep that kind of thing in mind going on with a baby.
Of course. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for appearing on the podcast today, Rebecca. It's great to reconnect with you after a couple of years since I've not talked with you, and also to see how well you're flourishing in your new environment and going through the the stress. I should say, welcome to the kind of fraternity of new parents. We all go through that, and I'm glad you've got a good support network there and an excellent employer. It sounds like who's
Absolutely.
working with you on all of those things. Did you have any last advice for people who are thinking about a philosophy major? I know you said Mike Miller sold you on philosophy, and maybe other people would be sold like that. But if Rebecca were to sell somebody on philosophy, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's contemplating it?
I just can't think of a better way to learn about the human condition and the human experience. It's so invaluable. And I think that that's also, maybe it's a greater comment about a liberal arts education in general too, but going into the working world and understanding the different perspectives that people come from is so helpful. I mean, anybody can take a class on how Microsoft works and, how to write an email. And those are things that are very learnable. But having the experience of just sitting in class and talking about what it means to be human, and then to be able to approach real life situations, knowing that somebody could be coming from a totally different perspective than something you're useful, it's invaluable. And I frequently reflect on the class that I took at the Mount on Islamic philosophy, which is not something that I ever would have studied, having gone through Catholic education my whole life, and having predominantly Christian friends coming from that background. I really didn't know a lot about the Islamic faith prior to taking that class. And so just the exposure to different kinds of concepts and beliefs, being able to connect to people now in the real world. If I have a client that comes from that faith, now I know why they might not want to meet at certain times, or why they might not want me to act on, certain theories that I come up with. Similarly, Dr. Buck is very strong in his Jewish faith, and I took philosophy of law from him. And that was a really interesting perspective, because as we know, the Jewish faith is where we got a lot of the laws and a lot of the philosophies that are still important in our society today. So having that background to be able to connect with people has really been huge, really been important to me. And I would say that, there are certain reasons why you want certain majors if you know that you're going to go into a particular field. But if you don't really know what you want to do with your degree, and you think that maybe perhaps there's a chance you want to get a master's or continued education, if there's no reason why you can't major in philosophy, you should. Because college that's what it's for, to talk about things that you're never going to have the opportunity to just sit in a room and talk about the human condition again after you graduate. And, those skills are not as learnable once you graduate college. So it's really important to be able to connect with people.
Fantastic advice. Thank you again, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. And I hope good luck with your daughter and
Thank
with your
you.
practice.
Thank you very much. Have
Bye-bye.
a good one. It was good to see you.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.